Every year, the small town of Oakhaven held a Halloween party that was full of fun, games, and frights. And this year was no different. But when the clock struck midnight, things took a turn from spooky to terrifying. As the town's costumed party-goers made their way home, they began to notice something strange happening in the local cemetery. Every single grave had opened up. Some of the headstones had been toppled over, and some of the coffins were completely shattered. At first, the townspeople thought it was just some teenagers being disrespectful. But when they got closer, they realized that this was no prank. The wind began to pick up, and the trees started to shake violently, even though there was no storm on the horizon. As if something was rising from its grave, the old iron gates of the cemetery suddenly creaked open. Everyone gasped as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and skeletal with long, dirty rags hanging off its bones. The townspeople screamed and ran for their lives, tripping over tombstones and each other in their haste to get away. But then more figures appeared, stumbling out of the cemetery, all of them as tall and scary as the first. They were the dead residents of Oakhaven, risen from their graves to take their revenge on the living. The townspeople fled to their homes, locking themselves inside as best they could. But the dead were relentless and soon began to gather outside, their hollow eyes staring through the windows, their skeletal fingers tapping impatiently on the glass. Some of the townspeople tried to hide in the church, but the dead soon surrounded the building, their voices rising in a chorus of angry moans and unintelligible whispers. All night long, the dead roamed the streets of Oakhaven, knocking on doors, shaking windows, and generally causing havoc. The townspeople huddled in their homes, too afraid to come out or call the police. What was happening to their town? Was this some kind of mass hallucination? Were they going crazy? Finally, as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, the dead began to disappear, staggering back to the cemetery and disappearing into the shadows. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the townspeople cautiously emerged from their homes to find their town in complete chaos. The streets were littered with overturned cars and smashed windows, and many of the houses were completely destroyed. But the most disturbing sight of all was the cemetery. Every single coffin had been dug up and was now lying open and empty. The townspeople searched the graves for their loved ones, but they were nowhere to be found. Had the dead really risen from their graves and gone on a rampage? Or was there some other explanation for what had happened? As the day wore on, more and more townspeople began to come forward with strange stories. Many of them claimed to have seen their dead relatives and friends wandering around town, while others said they had felt a cold hand on their shoulder or heard the sound of footsteps behind them, even though they were alone. Some even claimed to have seen the tall, skeletal figure that had emerged from the cemetery, and it wasn't any of the townspeople. They knew the dead didn't stay buried for long in Oakhaven, and so they set about their day, trying to clean up the mess and make sense of what had happened. But as the sun began to set, the dead began to stir. Once again, the townspeople watched in horror as the graves began to open and the dead started to rise. They fled to their homes, barricading themselves inside as the night wore on. The dead roamed the streets, their voices growing louder and angrier. Then, just as suddenly as they had risen, they disappeared. When the townspeople ventured out to check the cemetery, they found that every coffin was once again empty. But this time, something else was there. Scratched into the headstone was a single word, "Run." The townspeople did as they were told, running away from Oakhaven as fast as they could. But where were they running to? There was nowhere to go. The dead had followed them, their voices echoing in their ears, their cold hands gripping their shoulders. The townspeople stumbled through the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests. Then, just as suddenly, it was as if the dead had vanished. The voice stopped, the hands disappeared. The townspeople dared not stop running, though, until they reached the edge of town. There, hidden in the shadows, was a group of people who looked as though they hadn't moved for days. They were thin and dirty, their clothes in rags, and their eyes were wild and unfocused. One of the newcomers stepped forward. "What happened?" he asked. "Where are we?" A woman in a tattered nightgown slowly turned her head. "Oak Haven," she whispered, "is cursed.